Tiara stood at the riverbank under the pale moonlight, her reflection staring back at her. The faint ripples in the water seemed to whisper warnings, but she brushed them aside. She was determined to fulfill her mother's mission, but Pastor Gideon wasn't like the others. His faith was a fortress, impenetrable by force. If she wanted his soul, brute power wouldn't work. She needed patience, charm, and a plan. The next day, she returned to Gideon's church, not as a predator but as a humble seeker. She slipped into the back of the congregation, observing, waiting. Her beauty and grace caught people's attention, but she downplayed it, keeping her head low and avoiding unnecessary eye contact. When the service ended, she approached one of the choir members, a bubbly young woman named Esther. "You have such a beautiful choir," Tiara said softly, her voice laced with admiration. Esther beamed. "Thank you. Are you new here? You should consider joining us. We're always looking for more voices." Tiara hesitated, feigning shyness. "I've always loved singing, but I'm not sure I'm good enough." "Nonsense!" Esther exclaimed. "You're in God's house. Just come to rehearsal and see how it feels." Tiara smiled modestly. "All right, I'll think about it." At the next choir rehearsal, Tiara arrived dressed simply, her demeanor humble but elegant. She introduced herself to the choir leader, Brother Emmanuel, who asked her to audition. When she began to sing, the room fell silent. Her voice was ethereal, rich, and hauntingly beautiful. It seemed to wrap around the hearts of everyone present, pulling at their emotions. By the time she finished, some were in tears. Emmanuel blinked, stunned. "Sister Tiara, God has truly blessed you with a gift. You must join us." From that day on, Tiara became a beloved member of the choir. During Sunday services, her solos would bring the congregation to their knees. Her voice seemed to touch a part of their souls they didn't know existed. People would cry openly, lifting their hands in worship, thanking God for sending such a blessing to their church. After every service, members of the congregation would approach her, praising her talent. "Sister Tiara, your voice is anointed," an elderly woman told her one Sunday. "When you sing, I feel the presence of God so strongly." "You're a gift to this church," another man said. "Don't ever stop using your voice for His glory." Tiara would smile warmly, thanking them with humility. Inside, however, she was calculating. Every tear shed, every heart moved by her voice, brought her closer to her goal. Tiara noticed something interesting during her time in the choir. Pastor Gideon had a deep appreciation for music. Whenever the choir performed, his eyes would close, and he would sway gently, as if the music transported him to another realm. It was clear that music was his weak spot, the one thing that could reach him on a deeper level. She decided to use this to her advantage. One evening, after choir practice, she approached Gideon in his office. "Pastor," she began softly, "I've been working on a new song. I was wondering if you could listen and tell me if it's suitable for Sunday service." Gideon smiled warmly. "Of course, Sister Tiara. Please, let me hear it." She began to sing, her voice even more powerful in the intimate setting of his office. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and the lyrics spoke of redemption, love, and the power of faith. Gideon was visibly moved, his eyes glistening with unshed tears by the time she finished. "That was breathtaking," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "God has truly anointed you, Sister Tiara." She smiled demurely. "Thank you, Pastor. I just want to use my gift to serve Him." But as she left his office, her smile turned into a sly smirk. She had seen the way he looked at her, not just as a pastor admiring a member of his congregation, but as a man captivated by something beyond his control. Tiara became the star of the church, adored by everyone. Women sought her advice, men admired her from afar, and children followed her around like she was a saint. She played her role perfectly, kind, humble, and deeply devoted. She organized choir workshops, visited the sick in the community, and even started a children's singing group. The church grew even more because of her. People traveled from other towns just to hear her sing during services. She was no longer just a member of the church, she was its heart. But Tiara wasn't just winning over the congregation. She was studying them, learning their weaknesses, their fears, their secrets. She knew which members were struggling with sin, which ones were doubting their faith, and which ones had skeletons in their closets. She gathered this information quietly, filing it away for when she might need it. Pastor Gideon couldn't deny the impact Tiara had on the church. She was a blessing, a beacon of light that brought joy and hope to everyone she touched. But there was something about her that unsettled him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he often found himself praying for clarity, asking God to reveal any hidden truths. One night, as he knelt in prayer, He felt a strange heaviness in his spirit. A vision flashed before his eyes. Tiara, standing by the river, her hands glowing with an unnatural light. He heard a voice, faint but clear, "Be watchful, for she is not what she seems." Gideon's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. Was this a warning? Or was it just his imagination? He resolved to keep a closer eye on Tiara, even as he struggled with the guilt of doubting someone so seemingly pure. The choir member, Ruth, was tidying up after an evening rehearsal when she heard faint whispers echoing from the sanctuary. Curiosity piqued, she crept closer, her footsteps silent on the polished wooden floor. Peering through the slightly ajar door, her heart nearly stopped. There stood Tiara, her form no longer the humble, radiant figure everyone admired. Her true form was otherworldly and terrifying. Her eyes glowed an eerie crimson, her skin shimmered unnaturally, and dark tendrils of energy swirled around her. She was speaking to a shadowy, ethereal being, a spirit with a voice that dripped malice. "You're too slow, Tiara," the spirit hissed. "You've charmed the sheep, but the shepherd still stands firm. His soul must be claimed soon, or the mission will fail." Tiara's voice was cold, devoid of the warmth she used in the church. "I know what I'm doing. His faith is strong, but I see cracks forming. He won't hold out much longer." Ruth's breath hitched, and Tiara's head snapped toward the door, sensing the presence. Ruth fled, her pulse thundering in her ears as she bolted outside into the cool night air. She found Minister Joseph, pacing near his car, and ran up to him, trembling. "Minister Joseph," she gasped. I saw her. Tiara, she's not human. She's something else. She was talking to a spirit in the sanctuary." Joseph frowned, concern etched on his face. "What are you saying, Ruth? Calm down. I'm serious." Ruth insisted, her voice rising. Her eyes were glowing, and there was something dark, evil, around her. "She's not who we think she is." Joseph shook his head, trying to soothe her. "Ruth, Tiara is a blessing to this church. How could someone so anointed, so gifted by God, be what you're saying? You're tired. Maybe you misinterpreted what you saw." "No!" Ruth nearly shouted. "I know what I saw. You have to believe me." Their raised voices drew the attention of the other ministers nearby, who came over to see what was happening. Ruth repeated her story, her hands trembling, but the others looked at her with skepticism. "How could someone like Sister Tiara be evil?" one minister asked. "She's brought so much light and growth to this church. God sent her to us." Ruth felt a wave of frustration and desperation. "I'm telling you, she's deceiving all of us. Please, you have to." A soft, familiar voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see Tiara standing on the steps of the church, looking every bit the serene, humble servant they all adored. She wore a simple dress, her hair tied back, her expression one of gentle concern. "Ruth," Tiara said sweetly, her tone laced with care. "You seem upset. Are you feeling all right?" Ruth froze, her heart racing. "You," she stammered, pointing at her. "You're not who you say you are. I saw you." Tiara's expression shifted ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. But she quickly masked it with a soft, understanding smile. "Ruth, you've been working so hard lately. Perhaps you're overexerting yourself. Sometimes, exhaustion can play tricks on the mind." "She's lying!" Ruth shouted, backing away. "You all have to believe me." Tiara stepped closer, her presence almost soothing despite Ruth's terror. She reached out as if to comfort her, but Ruth flinched away. "Let me pray for you," Tiara said softly, her voice dripping with false kindness. "You seem troubled, and I want to help." The ministers began murmuring among themselves, unsure of what to believe. Tiara turned to them, her expression calm and composed. "Please, don't be too harsh on Sister Ruth. We've all been under a lot of pressure lately. Let's show her compassion." Minister Joseph nodded reluctantly. "Perhaps you're right, Sister Tiara. Ruth, maybe you should take some time to rest." Ruth's eyes darted between the ministers and Tiara. No one believed her. And now, Tiara was standing there, looking like a saint while Ruth felt like the mad one. "I'm not crazy," Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's fooling all of you." Tiara smiled gently, but her eyes gleamed with a hidden menace that only Ruth could see. "Come inside, Ruth," she said softly. "Let's talk. I'll help you feel better." Ruth shook her head furiously and bolted into the night, determined to find someone, anyone, who would believe her before it was too late. As Tiara watched her flee, her smile faded. She turned to the ministers, her voice calm but firm. "She's troubled. I'll pray for her." But as she walked back into the church, her serene expression darkened, and her true thought surfaced. "I'll deal with her soon enough." Ruth ran through the quiet streets, her heart pounding like a drum. The cold night air burned her lungs, but she didn't stop. She reached her small home and locked the door behind her, bolting it for extra measure. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone, dialing the number of a trusted elder from a neighboring church. "Elder Thomas," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Please, I need your help. I've seen something terrible." Thomas, known for his discernment, listened intently as Ruth recounted everything she had witnessed. "Stay calm, Ruth," he said firmly. "I'll pray for you right now. Do not let fear consume you. God is with you." As they prayed over the phone, Ruth felt a flicker of peace. But it was short-lived. A faint knock at the door shattered the moment. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she approached the window, peeking through the curtain. Tiara stood outside, bathed in the pale light of the street lamp. Her serene smile was gone, replaced by an expression that sent chills down Ruth's spine. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her voice, though muffled by the door, was unervingly sweet. "Ruth," Tiara called. "It's me. I'm worried about you. Please, let me in." Ruth backed away, clutching her Bible. "Go away," she shouted. "Leave me alone." The smile on Tiara's face twisted into a menacing snarl. "You shouldn't have interfered," she hissed. Suddenly, the air grew thick with an oppressive presence. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. Ruth fell to her knees, praying fervently, but Tiara's voice rang out, dark and commanding. "Your prayers won't save you, Ruth." There was a loud crash as the door burst open, and Ruth screamed. That night, her cries were the last sound anyone heard from her. The next morning, the church was in mourning. News of Ruth's death spread quickly, and the congregation was devastated. Though the cause of her death was ruled mysterious, whispers of something sinister began circulating among the members. One of the ministers, Brother Emmanuel, couldn't shake the memory of Ruth's frantic warnings. "She said Tiara wasn't what she seemed," Emmanuel told Pastor Gideon during a meeting. "I didn't believe her then, but now, I feel like I should have listened." Gideon, still unsettled by the vision he had during prayer, nodded gravely. "We can't ignore this anymore. There's something dark at work here. We need to pray." Meanwhile, Tiara continued her charade, singing at every service and offering comfort to the grieving congregation. But her true mission hadn't changed. One by one, she began targeting the ministers, exploiting their weaknesses and claiming their souls for her mother, the Queen of the Marine Kingdom. Despite her efforts, Pastor Gideon remained untouchable. His faith was unyielding, and his constant prayers created a barrier she couldn't penetrate. Frustrated, Tiara began devising new ways to break him. But Emmanuel, haunted by Ruth's words, approached Gideon again. "Pastor, we need to confront this. I believe Ruth was right. There's something unholy about Tiara." Gideon's face darkened with determination. "Then we'll fight this with prayer. If she's truly a servant of darkness, God will reveal the truth." On Sunday, the church was packed. People came from far and wide to hear Tiara sing. She took her place at the front, her voice soaring through the sanctuary. The congregation wept, their hands lifted in worship. But as Tiara sang, something began to change. A powerful presence filled the room, one that wasn't of the Marine Kingdom. Tiara faltered, her voice cracking. She clutched her chest, gasping for air. Suddenly, her body convulsed, and her form began to shift. Before the stunned eyes of the congregation, Tiara transformed into a mermaid-like creature. Her legs became a shimmering tail, her skin glowed with an unnatural light, and her eyes turned a piercing crimson. The congregation screamed, some falling to their knees in shock and fear. Tiara let out an enraged roar, her voice shaking the very walls of the church. "You fools," she bellowed. "You dare defy the Queen of the Marine Kingdom?" She turned her glowing eyes toward Gideon, who stood at the altar, praying fervently. She lunged at him, but an unseen force stopped her. Gideon's prayers grew louder, and the congregation joined in, crying out to God for protection. Tiara writhed, her screams echoing through the sanctuary. "You can't stop me," she shrieked. A dark, towering figure appeared, a woman with flowing hair like seaweed and eyes like deep, endless waters. The Queen of the Marine Kingdom had arrived. "You've meddled in our affairs for the last time, Gideon," the Queen said, her voice like the crashing of waves. "Surrender now, and I might spare your flock." But Gideon stood firm, raising his hands in prayer. "The Lord rebuke you," he declared, his voice filled with authority. The congregation echoed his prayer, their voices rising in unison. A fierce battle ensued. The queen unleashed waves of dark energy, but they dissipated against the prayers of the faithful. Tiara, now weakened and desperate, tried to attack once more, but she was struck down by the power of their prayers. The queen let out a final, anguished scream as she and Tiara collapsed to the ground. Their forms shimmered and dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint, salty breeze. The church was silent, the congregation too stunned to speak. Finally, Gideon broke the silence. "We have seen the power of God today. Let this be a reminder that no darkness can overcome the light." Though they were shaken, the congregation began to pray, thanking God for his deliverance.